This is the example of what we're going to be making today. It's like I said, the cross structure binding. And so what that's really talking about is the binding itself, the spine. And so let me open the book so you can kind of see. You can see it's kind of got a little paper weaving going on here that we're kind of weaving together. And so we're kind of sliding each cover into the other cover, right? So the inside, you can see the slot that I was talking about earlier. Yeah, and that'll be on the front cover and the back cover. And then we're going to be doing 4 signatures today, just like this book here. And each signature is just that folded piece of paper, pad of paper. So each folded book of paper here, like here we have 4. We have 4 signatures. And so we're going to be making 4 today. And then there's a little weaving that goes through, or binding that goes through. And you can see with the holes, the binding on the inside, and then how it shows up on the outside. Okay. All right, so the bookbinding that we're doing today is the cross structure binding. And it is a little technical, so we're going to take our time with it. If you have the handout, it'll look something like this. It has some starting measurements for you. So if you've already prepped your paper, that's good. We'll start with those measurements. However, I'm going to start by talking about how to make that size, how to prep it to get ready for us. But in this handout, it's step by step how to do this process, and then the list of supplies at the top. So it's pretty handy to have around, and also handy to kind of write notes on as well. We'll go over supplies really quickly before we jump in our process. Now, just like many of our bookbinding techniques that we learn, we have our core supplies, and we're going to be using all of them today. So we'll start off with our awl, or something sharp and pointy. If you have an ice pick, a safety pin, a thumbtack, anything like that, anything that will poke a hole will be helpful. The awl is nice because it starts off really small and gets larger as it goes up, so you can make that hole as large as you need it to be. So having the awl handy, we'll also need our tapestry needle and embroidery floss. Now you don't have to use embroidery floss. You can use twine, ribbon, string, yarn, anything that's like flossy like this will work well. I'm going to use actually some gray embroidery floss today, and then my tapestry needle. And the tapestry needle is nice because it has that large hole in it, so it makes it a little easier to thread larger string through. So if you're doing something like yarn or something like that, the tapestry needle is really nice. We'll also need, in the end, we'll need our glue stick. Now, if you don't have a glue stick, that's completely okay. Any kind of adhesive will work. So if you have tape, if you have tacky glue, Elmer's glue, any kind of glue, I like using the glue stick because it dries pretty quickly. It's a pretty fast glue, but any adhesive will work for today. Right. And then having that bone folder. The bone folder is helpful when it comes to making creases. So if you have the bone folder, it can help, especially when there's a thicker paper. It can help. If you don't have the bone folder, just using the handle of a pair of scissors works really well. That's typically what I use to help with the creasing. We will also need scissors for a part of this process today, so it's just good to have that on hand anyway. There are a couple things that we need that, well, they're not exactly necessary, but they're really helpful. So if you have them, go ahead and pull them out. One of them is a ruler. I generally have this little ruler with me by my side. It's good to have and help kind of measure out. Know that it doesn't have to be measured exactly, but it is helpful to have that ruler as a guideline. It's also helpful to have something like the binder clip. So if you're using binder clips, paper clips, a rubber band, anything like that to help hold paper in place while we're working with it can be really helpful. So I have some binder clips that I'll be using today. It'll also be helpful to have a pencil. So pencil, pen, anything like that that we can use to make marks will be helpful for this process. And then at one point in our process today, we're going to need to make a slit in our cover. And so if you have an X-Acto knife or a craft knife, that's the best tool to use, but you can still use it with a pair of scissors or make that slot with a pair of scissors. It doesn't have to be that craft knife, but it does make things a little easier when it comes to making those slots. And then the last thing we need is going to be our paper. So paper for the inside and paper for the cover. Now I'm using copy paper for the inside and cardstock for the cover. For this process, for this binding, it's helpful to have a thicker paper for the cover. So if you have cardstock, watercolor paper, a file folder, or like, anything that's just a little thicker, it'll work best for this cover. So I'm going to be using that cardstock today. And then copy paper for the inside. And of course, for the inside, any kind of paper will really work. So I'll just start off, we're going to prep our materials. Now, if you have a handout, you already have sizes laid out. If you haven't gotten your sizes ready yet, that's okay. We're going to start off by making our signatures. And we're going to need 4 signatures for that process today. And so I'm starting off with most of my books. I start off with the 8.5 by 11 because that's probably the most common size of paper that we can get. And so what I want to do with all my paper, and I've got 4 8.5 by 11s. What I'm going to do is cut them down to 8.5 by 5. That's going to be the size of my book today. So if you have scissors and a ruler, or if you have a paper cutter, go ahead and pull that out. And we'll go ahead and get started with creating that size for our book. All right, so the 8.5 by 5 is what we want to kind of start with today. And so because I started off with 4 pages of the 8.5 by 11, I'm going to do 2 for each of my signatures, okay? So 2 sections, 2 pieces, 2 pieces. All right, so now that we cut our paper, we have 4 signatures here. And so I'm going to take each of those and kind of fold them over. So what's happening is I'm making those signatures. Make sure we have 4. Now you can add, if you're making this book, again, you can add more paper to the inside. If you want, make a thicker signature. I'm using a really thin one today just for our example, but you can definitely add more paper to it. You can also do watercolor paper on the inside if you want to use this as like an art journal where you want to add more than just writing too. So we've got our 4 signatures, and these signatures are the 8.5 by 5. And the reason we're doing 5 is because that's going to help us with our measurements on the inside. So we have our 4 signatures. I'm going to set those aside. I'm going to go to my cover paper. So I'm using cardstock as my cover paper. And my cover paper, I want it to be the same size as my inside paper. So that measurement I did for my inside paper is the 8.5 by 5. And so I'm going to do the same thing for my cover paper. So if you have a paper cutter or scissors, you can go ahead and measure that out. Again, this is just the size that we're doing today. You can size it up or size it down, however. And so I've got the 8.5 by 5. We need 2 cover papers. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and fold those cover papers. So we have our 4 signatures that were the 8.5 by 5. We have 4 of them. I'm setting those aside. We're going to come back to them shortly, but we're going to focus on the cover right now. And so I've got 2 cover pages that are the 8.5 by 5, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of cut one side of each of these cover pages. So you can see in my example here that one side of the cover page is whole. The other side of that cover page has the slots in it, right? Those tabs. And so that's what we're going to make right now. So I'm going to start off. We want to make 5 tabs on on both of these cover pages. And so I'm going to use a marker so it's a little easier to see, and my ruler. So what does that look like? So I'm going to take my ruler here, put it in the crease of my cover, of one of my covers. And you can do this with a pencil. Again, I'm using a marker, so it's a little easier to see on camera. But I'm going to go, because it's 5 inches long, like I'm going to do 5 inches or 1 inch 5 times. So the first inch, I'm going to make a mark, and I'm doing that in the crease. That second inch, I'm going to make a mark, third inch, and the fourth inch. So I've got 5 equal sections. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to carry that mark out and make strips here. So I'm just going to kind of move over a little bit and do an inch all the way down so I can make that mark. And so I'm going to go ahead and do my measurement on both of my covers because I want that same thing on both of them. So I'm going to take, I did it to one cover. I'm going to do that to my other cover as well. And again, I'm going to be using a marker, but you can use a pencil for sure. And I'm just going to make those marks in that crease, right? And it's those one inch marks. So if you're doing that 5-inch wide book, it's 1-inch sections. And this is where like that ruler comes in handy. If you don't have a ruler handy, you can definitely eyeball it. It can be more more organic in its in its shape. And after I do those dots, I'm just going to kind of carry that line out so I know where to cut. And I'm going to do that all the way down. So this is what my piece, my covers look like right now. So I have my front cover and my back cover. And I have one side of each of those covers measured out into 5 strips, right? And we want them to be 5 equal strips. It doesn't matter exactly the distance, but you want them to be 5 equal strips. And so because we're doing 5-inch wide book, we're doing 1-inch strips. That's how we came up with this measurement for today. Again, you can do larger books or smaller books. You just want to make 5 equal strips. All right. So once we get that, we have our strips measured out. We're going to start that cutting. So if you have scissors, let's go ahead and cut on those marks. So we're cutting just one side of each of our covers, and we're cutting down to that crease, right? To that center fold. And so I'm going to cut all the way down. You can see my marks are a little crooked. It doesn't have to be perfect, which is nice. But I'm just cutting each of those marks that I made. And so you can see now that I've got it cut, I have the 5 actual strips. I'm going to do that to both of my covers. I'm going to do that to my front cover and to my back cover. And so just go ahead and cut those strips. And again, we're not cutting it all the way through. We're just cutting it to that crease. I'm just cutting it all the way down. All right. So with my front cover and my back cover, I have those solid outside covers, right? And the inside of each of them, I've cut into strips. And so each of these strips, just as a little reminder, each of those strips are the same size. Right? If you're doing the size that's in the handout, it's 5 inches, so it's just 1 inch segments. But we're cutting them into 5 equal strips. So the next thing that we're going to do is cut out some of these strips. We don't need all of them in each of those covers. So we're going to cut out some that we don't need, right? So my front cover here, I'm going to cut out 2 of those strips. And in my back cover, I'm going to cut out 3 of those strips, right? And so I'm just going to go right here. I'm cutting out these 2 strips, right? So the top strip, the bottom strip, and the middle strip, I'm keeping. It's the 2 strips that are in the center we're cutting out. And so for our back cover, we're going to kind of do the opposite. We're going to keep those inside ones. And so the ones that we're cutting out are the top, the middle, and the bottom, right? We're doing the opposite of what we did with the front cover. Okay. So I'm going to go do that now. In my front cover, I'm cutting off 2. And then in my back cover, I'm cutting off 3. And we're just cutting it right along that crease. So in that front cover, we cut off 2 pieces. So what's left are those 3 tabs. And the back cover, we cut off the 3 pieces. And so what's left are the 2 tabs. So this is what our book looks like currently, our cover here. The reason we have like the alternating tabs here is because they're going to weave together. So when we make our book, when we do put those covers together, it's going to kind of weave through like this, right? So you can see the 2 tabs that are on the back cover, they're going to end up on the front. 3 tabs on the front cover are going to end up on the back. It's just going to be that kind of weaving process. So we have our front cover, we have our back cover, we have those tabs cut. And so that next step that we're going to do is we're going to make those slots. We're doing 1 inch slots into the missing inside strips, right? And so what that means is the inside strips are going to be this one with our back cover, and it's going to be these 2 with our front cover. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a mark in each of those spaces. And this is going to be the slot that we weave these pages or these tabs through. So what does that look like? So I'm just going to take my ruler again. We're going to go in about 1 inch. You can do any distance here. If you want to make it kind of closer to the seam, that's fine. If you want to make it further out, that's also good. Either way is good. I'm going in about 1 inch, and then I'm making that 1 inch mark. So it looks kind of like this. Now I'm using a marker, so it's a little easier to see on camera, but it doesn't have to be super visible, right? So I'm going to come over to my front cover. That was for my back cover. I just need that 1 slot there with that missing inside strip. And then for my front cover, again, I'm going about 1 inch in, and I'm going to make an inch mark with each of those inside. So this is kind of what our cover looks like now. Our covers look like. Right. For each of our covers, we have the inside missing tab has the slits. So this is where if you have an X-Acto knife or a craft knife, this is really helpful to have. If not, you can still use your scissors with that. But I'm just going to take the blade of my X-Acto knife and I'm going to make that mark where I drew that line and just kind of cut it all the way through. So you see we've got that tab, right? Or that slot for the tab. I'm going to do that with my other side too. Just very carefully make that mark all the way down. Okay. So if you don't have an X-Acto knife, you can do a pair of scissors. Sometimes what I've done with sharp scissors is use kind of the tip of the blade to kind of cut it down. I've also used like a kitchen knife before for that. I don't know how safe that is, but you can use it with like a pair of scissors as well. And so we just want to make that slot all the way through. Like I said, these slots are where we're going to be weaving those tabs in. And so we want to kind of make sure we have those in place before we start the stitching process. So once we get those slots in place, what I'm going to do is set aside my front cover just for a little bit. And I'm going to focus on my back cover. This is where I'm going to do a lot of my binding today. Or this is where I'm going to be binding. So I'm going to pull out my signatures again, my 4 signatures. Take one signature here and just kind of lay it on that back cover and fold the tabs over. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my measurement so I know where to put the holes in my signature. Right? So where those holes need to be are on either side of those inside tabs. Okay. So for example, for this one, I'm just going to make a mark on the top, the bottom, top, and the bottom. So if I move my tabs out of the way, you can see I have the 4 marks. And so it's 4 or 5 equal spaces. Now, the reason we're doing it this way, instead of measuring out like the 5 equal spaces like we did with the cover, is that our measurement here is going to be a little off. And it's because we're stitching around those equal tabs, right? And so the measurement is not quite 5 equal spaces in our signature, but that signature is fitting around each of those tabs. What I'm going to do now is take all 4 of my signatures. I have the ends together. I'm just going to take my marker here and just kind of draw across the back. And what this is going to do is going to show me exactly where I need to poke the holes. I'm lining them up with my original hole that I made, or my original mark that I made. And that's so all of them are lined up. So that's what our next step is making sure our signature has marks. Each of our signature has the same marks. We want them to be lined up so we can stitch them together. Right? And because we're doing 5 tabs, we need 4 marks. So that next step is to actually poke those holes. So I'm going to get my awl. And if you have an awl, go ahead and pull that one out now. If you don't have the awl, again, anything that's like sharp and pointy will work for this. So I'm going to open my signature up so I can see those 4 holes or the 4 marks. And I'm going to take my awl and mark through each of those marks, poke through each of them. So be careful with it, but go ahead and poke those holes. And again, we're poking those holes right along that crease, right along that seam. So with my first signature, I poked those holes right through the 4 marks. So I have 4 holes now. And I'm going to do that with each of my signatures. make the mark that's right on that seam. And poke the hole all the way through. So each of those marks is now a hole. Let's see. Now, as I said, I'm using a marker, so it's a little easier to see. But if you want that mark hidden using a pencil, works just as well. And then just go ahead right now and kind of mark, use that all and poke through all those marks on each of those signatures. And said, that's what we're going to be kind of doing our binding. That's what we're going to be doing our binding through today. And I'm making the holes big enough for my tapestry needle to go through. I'm using embroidery floss for the binding. But if you're using something thicker like yarn or ribbon or something like that, you want that hole to be a little bigger. Okay. And of course, for my example, I've got some very thin signatures. You can definitely add some more paper, have thicker signatures, more pages if you like. We're going to need some embroidery floss and our tapestry needle. You can also use, instead of embroidery floss, you can also use like yarn, twine, thread, string, even like ribbon, stuff like that works well. I'm going to be using a silver embroidery floss today. And of course, our tapestry needle. The tapestry needles are really nice to work with because they have that big eye. And so we can use some of the like thicker threading and floss for our binding. So it's always good to have on hand. We'll also need our glue stick today. One of the last things that we'll do is glue down the little tabs that we have in there. And so you can use a glue stick. It's ideal. I like using the glue stick because it dries quickly. But you can also use tacky glue, Elmer's glue, tape, basically any type of adhesive will work. And it's because those tabs that we're gluing down are on the inside. So it doesn't have to be something that's like invisible, if that makes sense. Something else that helps with what we're doing today are going to be those binder clips. It's always handy to have binder clips, paper clips, rubber bands, stuff like that really helps kind of secure things and hold them in place while we're working on them. It's not absolutely necessary. It's just kind of a helpful addition. And of course, we'll need scissors to do some trimming. All right, so now to get started, I'm going to go ahead and thread my tapestry needle. There we go. And to give me enough thread, I'm just going to kind of cut off about a yard. That's going to be a little more than I need, but it's always best to have more than not enough. If we do get to a point where it's not enough, we can talk about how to add that embroidery floss. All right, so I'm doing about a yard of the embroidery floss, and I'm going to go ahead and thread my tapestry needle with it. Okay. So if you're following along, go ahead and pull out that back cover and one of your signatures. We're going to be stitching, basically stitching our signatures together, as well as stitching them onto that back cover, right? And again, that back cover is the one that has the two tabs. If you'll remember, the holes that we have in our signatures line up with those tabs, and it's exactly for stitching onto those tabs, lining up perfectly. And so what we're going to start doing is I'm going to go ahead and open my signature up. So I've got the very center of my signature. And I'm holding the cover, the back cover, onto my signature. So it's lining up perfectly. Now that first step, that first stitch is I'm starting from the center of my first signature, Now I'm going to go ahead and start at the bottom. And I'm going to go from the inside of my signature to the outside, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pull that through. I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail. It doesn't have to be long, maybe like 4 or 5 inches. And so I've stitched that embroidery floss through. I'm on the outside. And so when I stitch back in through my signature, I'm stitching around that tab, that first tab. Okay. So again, what I'm doing is I'm stitching my signatures together and basically using that cover, the tab of the cover, as that base. Okay. So I started from the inside, my very first stitch. I thread it through. I'm leaving a tail, not a long one, but I'm leaving just a little one. And so I'm going to go in that next hole that's on the other side of that tab. I'm going to go from the outside to the inside. Okay. So now my embroidery floss, the ends of my embroidery floss are on the same side. They're both on the inside. And the outside, I have the embroidery floss stitched around that tab. So my next step before I continue on is to tie that off. So I'm just going to go ahead real quickly, and it doesn't have to be anything special. I'm just going to do a little double knot, make sure it's tied tightly. And this will allow me to pull it tightly when I'm doing the other stitches. So go ahead and tie those ends off. And I'm going to cut that little bit of a tail just so I don't get it tangled up in whatever I'm working on. Okay. So just as a reminder, we started from the inside. Our very first stitch was going through that bottom hole, going from the inside to the outside. We stitched around that tab and went in that second hole. So we're back on the inside. Okay. We tied it together, and now we're going to continue our stitching. Okay. So that next stitch, we're just going to go to that next hole. So I'm going to that third hole. We did the first one, second, I'm going to the third hole. I'm starting from the inside and going to the outside. And you can see I'm lined up with that other tab, right? So I'm stitching that through. And you can see on the cover, I can stitch around that tab and go back in. Right? And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Stitch it through. And so what's happening? Whoop. Don't knot things off. I feel like every time I use embroidery floss, at some point, I'm like, dealing with knots. So on the outside cover, this is the back cover, the only place we're seeing stitches are across the tabs. We're not seeing the stitches in between the tabs. We're only seeing those stitches across the tabs. And so if I bring my example back, that's how it's lining up. We're only stitching across those 2 tabs. We're not going to see the stitches anywhere else. So when I come to the inside, I've come in that 4th hole, so I'm at the top. One of the things that we want to see for each of the insides of the signatures is we're going to see, let me pull my example back out. We're going to see stitches all the way down. There's not going to be a gap. And so because I have a gap right here, I'm going to go back in that 3rd hole. Okay. So I came in that 4th hole. I'm in the inside of my signature. I'm going to go out that 3rd hole. Okay. We're just going to pull that tightly. So we've got our first signature stitched in. Okay. So on the inside, we have stitches all the way down. And on the outside, the only stitches, again, are across those tabs. Okay. So now it's time to add our second signature. So I'm going to take my second signature, open it up to the inside, and lay it on top of my first signature. So if we look at where everything is lining up right now, my embroidery floss is coming out of that third hole. Can everyone see that? It's coming out of the third hole. So what I'm going to do is take that tapestry needle and I'm going to go in to the third hole of my second signature. I'm not stitching around the outside cover. I'm going to go straight in that hole. So let me set this up. So I'm going to stitch in that third hole and pull it through. All right, so on the inside, my embroidery floss is in that third hole. And on the outside, we still only see the stitches on the tab. So once we pull that embroidery floss through our second signature, we're going to go to that top hole and we're going to thread through. Right? So I'm going from the inside of that second signature through that top hole to the outside. So I've got that first stitch here and then stitch around that tab. I'm going to go back into that hole. So I'm going back into the hole I just went out of, right? So I'm in that second hole and I'm going to continue going down. Again, on the outside, all you're seeing are the stitches across the tab. We're not doing any stitches on the outside that are seen. It's just going to be seen on those tabs, right? On the inside, we'll see a stitch in between each of the holes. So I'm in the second hole down. I'm on the inside. So I'm going to go out through the next hole. So I'm just going down the spine, right? So I'm going to take my tapestry needle and go from the inside to the outside. And you can see that tapestry or embroidery floss. Again, it skipped that center. The only stitch we're seeing is on those tabs. So I'm coming out of that third hole and I'm stitching across the tab, going into that fourth hole. Right. So what we're seeing on the outside now, we're on our second signature, and we should be seeing 2 stitches on each of those tabs. So on the inside, again, like I said, on the inside, we're wanting a stitch in between each of those holes. And so because I'm at that bottom hole now, I'm going to stitch into that next hole. So I'll have a stitch in between each of those holes. So I'm going from the last tab up 1, stitching from the inside to the outside. So now I have a stitch in between each of those holes. And if I look at the outside, I still only have a stitch across those tabs. So our next step is to add our third signature. And we're basically doing the same stitch back and forth, just going up and down, back and forth, which with each of these signatures. So I'm going to take my third signature, bring that in. I'm opening it up to the center where my 4 holes are. I'm going to lay it on top of my 2 already stitched signatures. Okay. So I have my third signature I'm placing right on top. And my embroidery floss is on the outside, stitched in the third down hole. So I'm going to stitch in that same hole, but on the third signature, if that makes sense, right? So instead of stitching across my tab, I'm going in that same hole, that same place, but on the third signature. So we're on our third signature. And because I'm in one of the middle holes, I'm going to go ahead and stitch down to that bottom hole. And again, we want stitches in between each hole that's on the inside of the cover, or the inside of the signature. And on the outside, we only want stitches across the tabs, no stitches on any of the other spaces. Right. So I'm going to take my embroidery floss and stitch through that bottom hole. I'm going from the inside of my third signature through the bottom hole to the outside. And I'm pulling it all the way through. So now we have a bottom stitch on the inside, and on the outside, we're in that bottom hole. So we're just going to start stitching up to the top. So I'm going to go around my tab and stitch into that next hole. So that stitch that I'm making is going across that tab. So I'm stitching from the outside to the inside. So I'm back in one of the middle holes. Okay. So now, like I said, we're just going to start stitching up. So I'm going to go to that next hole and stitch through. I'm going from the inside of my third signature to the outside, and I'm pulling it all the way through. So on the inside, you can see I've got 2 stitches. And on the outside, you can see I'm coming in right around that tab. So I'm going to take my signature, or not my signature, my tapestry needle, and go around that top tab into the hole and thread it through to the inside. So what we're seeing on the outside now is 3 stitches on each of those tabs. Okay. And what we're seeing on the inside are the 2 stitches and a blank space. So again, we want stitches in each one of those gaps. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle and go in that next hole down. So I have a stitch in between each of the holes. So I'm going from the inside to the outside again. So on the inside of our third signature, the inside, we have a stitch in between each hole. And on the outside, we only have a stitch on top of the tabs. So now our next step is to do that 4th signature. And we're going to just continue to build the same way we've been doing it. So I'm going to take my 4th signature. It's my last signature, but you are, of course, welcome to add more signatures. I'm going to take my signature and I'm going to lay it on top of my 3 already stitched signatures. So I'm coming out in the middle, right? I'm not going to stitch around anything, but I'm going to connect my last signature. So I'm going to go in the hole that's right next to it, right? I'm not stitching over a tab or anything. I'm going back into basically the same hole that's in the different signature, that 4th signature. So I'm going to stitch in all the way through. And that's the stitch that's kind of connecting my 4th signature to the rest of my book, right? I'm on the inside. And again, we want stitch in between each of the holes. So I'm going to go back up to my top one. So I get that stitch there. I'm going to go from that top hole from the inside of my 4th signature to the outside, pull it all the way through. So I have that first stitch. So on the inside, we see a stitch on the top, and on the outside, I'm at the top of the tab. So again, we came from the inside, we went through that top hole, and now we're on the outside. And so my next step is to take my tapestry needle and cross over the tab and go to that next hole. So I'm going to stitch it through. So now you can see I have 4 stitches on my top tab. 1 stitch for each signature. So on the inside, I'm in the hole down, the next hole, that second hole. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle and move down to that next hole. Again, making a stitch in between each of those holes. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle and go through that next hole from the inside of my 4th signature to the outside. and I'm going to pull it tightly. So now I have 2 stitches on the inside, and on the outside, I'm lined up with that next tab. So what I'm going to do is that last stitch, right? I'm going to take my tapestry needle, go across that tab and into that last hole and stitch it all the way through. So now what we're seeing on the outside are 4 stitches across each of those tabs. And on the inside, you can see I've got 2 stitches at the top and I have a gap here. Okay. So if you are adding another signature to it, we're only doing 4 today, but if you're adding another signature to your book, you'll go back in to that hole. And it's because we're making that stitch on the inside, and we'll just follow through like the same way we did with the other signatures, stitching it across each tab and then 1 stitch in between each of those inside holes. Okay. So if this is your last signature that you're working with, then this is a good time to tie it off, right? So we're going to tie it off basically the same way we tied off the first one. So it'll look like a stitch in between each of the holes. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull it tightly. And sometimes, like, when we've been stitching like this, it may take a little finagling to make it tight. I know I don't have the strongest grip when I'm doing bookbinding. That's where like those binder clips or paper clips come in handy because they can hold everything secure while we're working through it. But you'll just kind of pull that tapestry needle, that embroidery floss, pull it tightly, and then we're going to tie our tail to that stitch, that middle stitch. And so that's what I'm going to do right now is go ahead and tie it off. Tie it tightly. And then trim it. So now we have a stitch in between each hole. Got my tapestry needle aside. All right. So what we have now is kind of a funny looking book. We have our back cover. We have our 4 signatures that are stitched together. And then we have those 2 tabs. And so one thing that helps me here is to just take a moment and bend that tab, bend it so it's right around these signatures. Because right now that tab is sticking up straight, right? And so I'm just going to bend that tab so it's folded neatly against my signatures, right? So it's not sticking out funny like this one is. I'm just taking a moment and folding it. This is not necessary, but absolutely necessary, but it is helpful when it comes to stitching that front cover or weaving that front cover into it. So let's go ahead and pull out our front cover. So this is where there's kind of a little tricky part because what we're going to do is weave in the tabs. We're going to weave the tabs together and stick those inside tabs. These 3 inside tabs are going to go in those slots that we made last week. And so a way to kind of see that a little easier. So I flip my book over. So I'm looking at basically the covers, the outside covers of my book. My signature is on the inside, right? And so what I'm going to do is stitch through or weave through my tabs, right? So what I'm going to do is take on my front cover, I have the 3 tabs. I'm going to take the center one. Coming across my back cover to that slot that we made. And I'm going to slide that center tab into that center slot. And so my next step is to take the tabs from my back cover, and I'm going to thread them through the slots in my front cover. Right? So what that looks like, let me pull this up. So I'm going to take both tabs from my back cover, that top tab, I'm going to slide it through that top slot. And that bottom tab, I'm going to slide it through that bottom slot. When we thread them through, they're going to be on the inside. The tabs are going to be on the inside cover. That top tab and that bottom tab, all we're doing is lifting up that back cover and putting that tab underneath it. So lifting up that bottom part, the back cover, and putting that tab underneath. So now what we have is everything is kind of woven in. Okay. So what I can do is just kind of push them together. So once we have everything woven in, we're just going to kind of push those tabs together. And you'll see where that stitching is kind of where that front cover stops. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is flip it over. So I'm at the inside. And so my next step is to glue down those tabs. Right. So you can do it with super glue, you can do it with glue stick, you can do it with tacky glue, tape, anything will work for this. But that's all we're going to do is glue those tabs down. So you see my front cover on the outside, I have 2 tabs that are through the slot. On the inside, I have the 2 tabs that are loose. On the back, I have that 1 tab that's thread through the slot. And on the inside, I have that 1 tab, but that's through the slot, but I have those 2 other tabs that are loose at the top and bottom. So what we're going to do is just kind of glue down those tabs that are on the inside.